Usually when I go into the workshop I have a pretty good idea of what I'm going to make. I've done some sketches, I've thought things through, and more often than not it turns out as I intended. But this month I tried to be a little bit more loose and just go in without a plan and just play a little bit and experiment. And so this is the first of 3 experimental pieces that I worked on this month. So a little while ago I made this piece. It's a wall-mounted abstract piece made of a series of carved wooden blocks that can be turned and twisted and rearranged into different compositions. So I wanted to do something similar but not wall-mounted or flat. I wanted it to be 3-dimensional, something that you could get your hands on and move around, rearrange in some way. So the plan was to cut a series of individual blocks and carve a very similar texture pattern onto the outside of them. And they would be threaded onto a piece of dowel to create a sort of 3-dimensional tower structure that could be twisted and turned, and you could change the orientation of each individual block to create different patterns and textures. So I'm just drilling a hole in the center of these 2 blocks, which will be the top and the bottom of the piece, and they'll be fixed in place and the other segments will be able to turn. I say top and bottom, but really I think this could be turned upside down. There's not really a true top and bottom to it. So I dug through my pile of scrap pieces of oak. This is all little ends of boards, pieces left over from projects. There are varying thicknesses which I wanted, and I was able to cut them down to these blocks, cut out any cracks and knots that I didn't want. And then I went through them all and found the center. My plan originally was to drill a hole exactly in the center of each of these so that would line up as a nice symmetrical tower. But actually when I came to drill the pieces, I decided to offset the central hole. Shifted the piece off center fractionally, just a few millimeters on each one, and that just made it a little bit more interesting in profile rather than just flat up and down. As you turned each piece, they jutted out different lengths either side. So once they were all drilled out, and I took them over to the table saw, and using this sled, I cut a groove into each of the 4 sides on all of the blocks. And I'm varying the position of that groove on each of them. It's kind of random, just trying to make sure that nothing sort of lines up in a really regimented way when they're put together. And each of these little grooves are designed to receive a small inset inlaid piece of wood in a contrasting colour, which will protrude slightly and give it some texture. It also sort of almost serves as a little handle to turn each individual piece. Over at the workbench, I start to try and carve some texture into the face of each of these. I start with cutting a thin line with a saw across the grain, and then coming in with a chisel and just cutting in at various angles to create this almost like a random sawtooth kind of texture in each one. Initially I thought, well, I could do this all the way around, but of course cutting this kind of a pattern or texture into the end grain is very difficult. So I just did this on the face grain, but actually I think this works really nicely. So you get the nice matte sort of finish, flat finish of the end grain on 2 sides, and then the other sides you have this carved texture. So once I finished carving those, it was time to start inserting these little tabs. In the oak, I'm using a slither of sapele, and then in the sapele pieces, these darker ones here, I'm using maple in a bright contrasted colour. So once the glue was dry, I took the sander out and sanded each side flush. But didn't want them to stick out too far because they might catch on the adjacent piece and stop them turning. So here I'm just putting on a nice oil and wax finish to each of the pieces. I'm trying to rub it into all of the little cracks and grooves and make sure that it absorbs into the grain. put it on really thick, and then you come back and wipe off any excess. I also cut these little wooden spacers, or washers I suppose, to go between each of the pieces, so that there'd be a relief gap between each one, so it would help them turn and they wouldn't catch on each other. I spent a little bit of time putting these in different order, different patterns. I think I got a nice balance in the end, because the top and the bottom will be fixed in place, so you can't sort of rearrange the order of these, you can only turn them. But I think this works quite nicely with the 3 darker wooden pieces spaced nicely between the lighter coloured oak. So all that was left ready on this one was to glue the top and the bottom in place, trying to put enough glue in there to make it stick, but not enough so that it would stop the pieces below turning. And then I clamped it in place and let it dry. Tried to make sure that the top and bottom pieces were in parallel to each other. So I had to sort of rig up this little clamping station on the workbench to make sure that was correct, and that was the piece pretty much done. I had in mind that this piece would sit on a shelf or a windowsill, and maybe you'd interact with it occasionally, turn it to change the way it looked. But actually the real joy of this piece is to pick it up and literally play with it, to roll it around in your hands. It's so tactile and lovely to hold and maneuver and touch. And I wasn't expecting that, but that's what this is for, I think, rather than just to be visually looked at. So this second piece I'm working on is a smaller version, or kind of based on a large piece that I did a couple of months ago. And this piece was big. It was, I think, 140 odd individual segments, which were hung on 4 rails. And each one could be taken out and moved around to create different patterns and textures. And I want to do something smaller, simpler, with just a handful of pieces, but change them a little bit so that the pieces could be not just rearranged side to side, but also be turned upside down. So I'm creating a little double-sided French cleat on the back of each individual piece. So I cut 8 pieces of oak and 2 pieces of Iroko, and each of these is cut to a slightly different length. The French cleat on the back is cut centrally, and then I trimmed the ends slightly different on each one so that they won't sit perfectly level on the rail. There'll be a stagger to them that will change depending on how you rearrange each piece. I'm treating the surface of these in a very similar way to the last piece, cutting a very thin groove across the face with a pull saw, and then using a chisel to carve in towards that line to create a ridge and trough and cut some texture into the surface. Over at the miter saw, I cut a groove line across each piece in different places, and I'm inserting a small slither of wood, contrasting cut of wood, into each of these. On the oak pieces I'm using a thin slice of sapele, and on the Iroko it's, I think that's maple. It's a very bright white piece of maple. Once the glue was dried, I took some sandpaper to these and went around and sanded down any sharp edges. I still wanted to keep the front to have a sort of roughish texture, so I didn't go too hard with the sandpaper on that, just went over to get rid of any sharp bits. I made a box frame with these dark splines out of sapele for this, and on the backer board I've fixed a oak piece of wood, which is a cleat. It's got a 45-degree angle on the top, which these pieces will hang, and I've put a matte black backer card behind that. I think these pieces are going to look really nice against that matte black background. Overall, I'm moderately happy with this piece. I think it kind of works. I think maybe the format is an issue. Perhaps it would work if it was more dramatic in its size. Maybe if it was twice the length, or even longer than that, one very, very long piece that could stretch along a wall. It feels like it's a part of something bigger. I don't know. I can't quite explain it, but it's not quite working. I think it's a good sort of sketch of something that could be working better on a larger scale. Still, it's quite nice to play with it, move stuff around, and get different effects. When the light shines across it at certain angles, you can really see the way that the texture stands out on the surface of each segment. A good starting point. I picked up this really beautiful book recently. Ligia Pape was an artist working, I think, primarily in the 50s and 60s. At least that's the period when she was making these incredible prints. They're woodblock prints. Some of them are very simple, some of them quite complex geometric designs, but the use of the woodblock makes them also feel very organic. And it's that combination of formal structure and organic texture is something that I find really inspirational, and something that I try and put into my work as well. It's really a beautiful book. For this project, I went back to something I'm quite comfortable with. I've made a lot of these pieces. It's something I keep coming back to. They're really about the creation of a rhythm and creating patterns that your eye will follow through. I'm very much inspired by minimalist composition, musical composition, and how overlapping time signatures go in and out of phase with each other. And I'm trying to do something similar here, but visually, so that your eye will lock onto a pattern and then jump to a different pattern, and you'll notice different patterns running through these pieces that are related to each other but also not related to each other. So I always start these by laying down sort of a base rhythm by cutting in these grooves into the wood at precise regular intervals, and then rearranging them in a more random way and cutting in these thicker grooves to create sort of an offset beat. And then each of these grooves will receive a different inlaid piece of wood. So these thicker ones are here. I'm using some sapele, some dark sapele, which I'm just cutting to length. And then for the smaller slits, I'm going to be using some thin pieces of veneer. So I've got this little box of thin veneer samples. I'm just going through trying to find something that works. I want a light coloured wood. I think this is possibly an ash, but I'm not really sure what most of these pieces of samples of veneer wood are, and a darker piece to contrast. I'm just dry fitting these at the moment. I'm not sticking them in yet, just making sure I've got them all cut to length. And I'll spend quite a lot of time here moving these thinner ones around and rearranging them, deciding where's the best place to fall. It's hard to say exactly what I'm looking for. It's more intuition than anything else. So I place the light ones first and then go in and fill in the rest of the gaps with the darker pieces. Very often when I'm making these, I'll spend quite a lot of time trying to find what is the right arrangement or the correct arrangement, and then I'll go back the next day and think, actually I should have done this slightly differently, which is one of the reasons why I started work recently on pieces that can be rearranged at will, where the segments are movable, because these really are sort of a fixed place in time that I've landed on an arrangement, but ultimately these pieces can work in various different ways, and that's where I think there's something quite interesting about the pieces where you can shuffle them around. So I'm pretty pleased with this. I think it works quite nicely, but before I go ahead and glue it all in, I decided, with that book I showed you earlier on in mind, that I might have a go at seeing what this would look like if I use this base block as a printing block. Now, it took me a long time to decide whether or not to do this, because on the one hand it could have some very interesting results, on the other hand this could completely ruin this block. I was hoping that it would be okay and I would be able to sand all the ink off afterwards, no problem, but it was a little risky that it wouldn't be the case. I was a little worried that the liquid content in the ink would make everything swell up and it wouldn't go back together afterwards, but anyway, it was worth a try. First print is a little bit like a first pancake, never quite goes well, but this wasn't too bad. I did do a second one with a little bit more ink, because although the grain showed up really nicely on this, I wanted it to be a little bit darker, so I inked up the block a second time. And it does look nicer, this print, nice and dark, and the grain looks really good. I also pulled one with this rich orange colour. And my idea is to cut small segments out of the black layer and have this underneath, maybe separated by a few millimeters of card, so that'd be a little bit of separation between the two, and maybe light would get down underneath, and I'll offset the orange one underneath it so that it doesn't match up exactly. So I went to work with the scalpel, carefully cutting these little segments out. I initially planned to cut all of the segments out, all of the little slits, but in the end I just cut the larger areas out and left the other ones just plain white. So I completely forgot to wipe the ink off of this block and ended up just leaving it in the sun for a while, hoping it would dry off completely so I could sand it easy, which it didn't really. It stayed really tacky. I should have known that would happen, but it did sand off okay. I took a 80 grit sandpaper to this. I didn't want to wear it down too much, I just wanted to get all the ink off. One unfortunate problem, which I didn't foresee when I was doing this, was that my workshop is now covered in lots of tiny little pellets of gooey ink which flew everywhere as I was sanding this off, and every time I put something down on a work surface and pick it up again, a nice clean board, it's got little ink spots all over it. So I could have kept sanding here and sanding all the way down till there was no evidence of the ink left, but actually some of this black ink, which has soaked down deep into the grain of this wood, looks really good, so I stopped before I got too far. Before I tried this printing idea out, I'd taken all these segments out and laid them out very carefully on this board in the correct order so I'd easily be able to put them back in. What I didn't film was that just before this is when I blew some sawdust off the top of the block and of course blew all of these pieces of veneer across the desk. So then I had to spend about 20 minutes trying to rearrange them back in the right order, looking at photographs of what I'd done before. So now it was just a case of dabbing a very thin line of glue on the bottom of each of these pieces and carefully gluing them into place. On a few of these other pieces, once I got it all glued together, I added some finish on there, some of that wax and oil finish. But this looked really nice in its raw matte form, so I haven't done that this time around. And here these two pieces are side by side. This printing thing was fun, and I might do some more of that in the future. But I'm really happy the way this wooden piece turned out. The ink actually adds a lot to this wood. The way it's just soaked into the grain in certain places gives it a whole other level of texture, which I really like. And yeah, I think I might do this again in the future. Overall, I was quite pleased with these projects. The print and the tower in particular are interesting, and I'll definitely try and develop those a little further. So thanks for watching. Maybe I'll see you next time.